Wembley, 1988. For minutes on the clock. Steve McMahon hasn't even broken a sweat yet, and he's already on the deck. Vinnie Jones has just gone through him, studs and all, early, reckless, borderline criminal by today's standards. No card. Not even a talking to. McMahon gets up, dusts himself off and just carries on. That's it. No fuss. No rolling around. Just gone. Bye-bye. For years, that single moment has been sold to us as the definition of football toughness. The hard man tackle. The one that ends up on every hardest man in football compilation, every nostalgia reel, every pub argument. And for years, McMahon has let people run with it. But here's the thing. When you actually sit him down and ask him what toughness really means, he doesn't go anywhere near that tackle. He barely mentions Vinnie Jones at all. Because to McMahon, that moment was theater. A highlight. Toughness, the real kind, the kind that decides titles and cup finals and reputations, was never about one crunching tackle in front of the cameras. It was about 5 men. 5 specific opponents and teammates who quietly rewrote what he thought hard actually meant. And once you hear who they are, and why, you start to understand why Vinnie Jones has spent decades getting credit for something Steve McMahon never actually believed in. Think about how these reputations actually get built in football. It's rarely the 90-minute performances that stick in the public memory. It's the clip, the one moment that gets cut, replayed, slowed down, turned into a thumbnail. Wimbledon's crazy gang understood that instinctively in the 80s, and Jones became the poster boy for it. A genuinely combative footballer whose legend eventually outgrew the actual football he played. That's not a criticism of Jones specifically. It's just how the machine works. One tackle, repeated for 35 years, becomes the entire story. McMahon lived on the other side of that machine for his whole career. Nobody built him a highlight reel around a single hit. What he got instead was 3 First Division titles, 2 FA Cups, and a reputation among the players who actually had to line up against him week after week as one of the most complete, combative central midfielders of his generation. That reputation wasn't built on a moment. It was built on hundreds of matches, most of which nobody clipped for YouTube. So when McMahon talks about toughness, he's not talking about the version the algorithm rewards. He's talking about the version that decided titles. And that version has 5 names attached to it, none of which is Vinnie Jones. Let's rewind. Way back. Before Anfield, before the medals, before any of it. September 1983. McMahon is at Aston Villa. 22 years old, hungry, quick-tempered, still finding out who he is as a footballer. Villa travel to Anfield to face a Liverpool side stacked with winners. And in the middle of it is a Scotsman who doesn't need to raise his fists to intimidate you. Graeme Souness. McMahon gets wound up. Kenny Dalglish and Souness see it happening and, by his own account, they lean into it. They needle him, they wind him tighter, and eventually he snaps and gets himself sent off. McMahon later admitted it plainly. They set me up. Kenny got me booked and Suey got me sent off. 2 of the smartest operators in English football, and a young midfielder walked straight into it. Here's why that day matters more than any tackle ever could. McMahon didn't come away from Anfield thinking Souness was the hardest man he'd faced because he'd kicked lumps out of him. Souness barely had to touch him. He came away thinking Souness was the hardest man he'd faced because he'd outthought him. Cleverness over chaos. Command over aggression. A man who controlled the temperature of a match without ever losing his own. That lesson didn't just sit there quietly either. Came back around in the strangest way. A year later, Souness left Liverpool for Sampdoria in Italy. The club needed someone to replace him in that midfield engine room. Someone with the legs and the nerve to fill a genuine legend's boots. In 1985, Kenny Dalglish signed Steve McMahon. The kid who got wound up and sent off at Anfield was now wearing the shirt of the man who'd done the winding. Let's just sit with that for a second. The player who taught McMahon what real control looked like was the same player McMahon was brought in to replace. You couldn't write that. Football did it for free. Now, to be fair for a second, Souness wasn't just a chess player. He could handle himself physically too. Everyone from that Liverpool dressing room will tell you that. There's a reason he's still spoken about in the same breath as some of the most feared midfielders English football has ever produced. But that's not what stuck with McMahon. What stuck with him was the calculation. the cold, deliberate use of pressure, applied by a player who never looked rattled, never looked rushed, and somehow always seemed to be one step ahead of whoever was trying to rough him up. That's an uncomfortable kind of toughness to admit to respecting, if you think about it. It's easier to celebrate the player who hits you than the player who manipulates you into hitting yourself out of the game. There's no viral clip for that. No slow-motion replay of someone getting quietly outthought over 90 minutes. But McMahon, a proud, combative player in his own right, was honest enough to admit that Souness had done exactly that to him, and honest enough to let it shape the rest of his career. That's toughness type 1. Mental. Almost surgical. Type 2 looks completely different, and it's local. It's not about a boardroom rivalry or a transfer saga. It's about two sets of fans who share a postcode and can't stand each other. It's Derby Day. Merseyside derbies in the 80s weren't matches, they were wars with a scoreboard. And on the blue side of that rivalry stood a player McMahon rated just as highly as anyone he ever lined up against. Peter Reid. Reid wasn't the biggest name in that Everton midfield. He wasn't the one getting the magazine covers. But ask anyone who actually played against him, and the word that comes up over and over is relentless. 90 minutes of pressing, closing down, chasing lost causes that shouldn't have been chaseable, and somehow still being there in the 91st minute doing exactly the same thing he was doing in the first. No reputation to hide behind. No headlines to coast on. Just work, over and over, match after match. Everton in that period were building something serious, a genuine title-winning side, and Reid was the engine that made the whole thing tick without ever being the name printed on the shirts that sold. Strikers got the goals. Wingers got the headlines. Reid got the ball back again and again, in areas of the pitch where most midfielders would rather not be sprinting in the 80th minute. That's a specific, unglamorous kind of hard. It doesn't photograph well. It doesn't clip well either. There's no single freeze frame that captures 90 minutes of a player simply refusing to stop running. And that's exactly why McMahon rated him so highly. Because McMahon knew, better than most, how easy it is to fake intensity for 5 minutes in front of a crowd, and how genuinely rare it is to sustain it for an entire match, an entire season, an entire rivalry that came around twice a year without fail. Reid never had a quiet derby. He couldn't afford one. Merseyside wouldn't have let him. Picture the Goodison crowd on Derby Day, the noise before kickoff, the sense that this particular 90 minutes mattered more than almost any other fixture on the calendar. Reid thrived in exactly that pressure, not by trying to intimidate anyone, but by simply refusing to be outworked. McMahon, standing opposite him in the middle of the park, understood that kind of toughness on a personal level, because it was the same demand he placed on himself. You don't get to switch off just because the cameras have moved elsewhere. You don't get to coast through the 60th minute because nobody's watching that closely. Reid never did, and McMahon never forgot it. McMahon himself, when pushed on who genuinely deserved to be called hard in that era, didn't reach for the obvious pantomime names. He reached for Reid, alongside Souness and Robson, and made the distinction crystal clear. Peter Reid wasn't the hardest, but he was tough. Not the hardest. Tough. There's a difference, and McMahon knew exactly what it was. Here's the pattern starting to form, and it's worth pausing on because it's the whole argument of this video. Every name so far has nothing to do with a single moment. Souness earns his spot for outsmarting a younger man over 90 minutes. Reid earns his for grinding through 90 minutes without ever switching off. No slow-motion replay, no viral clip, just full matches, done properly over and over again, season after season. That's toughness as McMahon actually understood it. Not the tackle, the consistency. And if Reid represented work rate without glamour, the next name on McMahon's list represented something closer to the complete package. Someone even McMahon, a serious operator himself, looked at and saw an equal. Manchester United's captain through the 80s, a box-to-box midfielder before that phrase was even fashionable. A player who did absolutely everything a midfield needs and did most of it while carrying an injury list that would have ended a lesser man's career 3 times over. Robson tackled, Robson passed, Robson scored, Robson led, Robson got back up. Vinnie Jones himself, when asked years later who the genuinely hardest players he ever faced were, put Robson right at the top of that list, alongside McMahon's own name. And Roy Keane, a man who does not hand out compliments for fun, once summed Robson up in a line that tells you everything. Tough as nails, brave, and a proper leader. Think about what Robson actually played through across his United career. Broken legs, torn hamstrings, a shoulder that dislocated so often it became a running joke among teammates, and yet he kept coming back, kept captaining the side, kept throwing himself into challenges that a more cautious player would have quietly avoided. That's not the toughness of a single tackle either. That's a decade-long refusal to let his body's own limits dictate how he played the game. Managers built teams around the assumption that Robson would somehow find a way to be fit for the biggest matches, and more often than not, he did. There's also something worth sitting with in the fact that Robson earns respect from both directions here, from a player of McMahon's own generation and from the next one entirely. When a midfielder as ferociously demanding as Roy Keane goes out of his way to praise a predecessor, that's not sentimentality. Keane isn't sentimental about much. That's a genuine acknowledgement that Robson set a standard the generation after him was still measuring itself against. Think about the sheer range Robson's game covered too. He wasn't a specialist. He wasn't the destroyer who left the creative work to someone else, and he wasn't the creator who let a designated enforcer do his defending for him. He did both in the same 90 minutes over and over, at a physical cost that would have quietly ended most careers years earlier. McMahon, a genuinely all-action midfielder himself, recognized in Robson something close to a mirror image, a player who understood that toughness without craft is just recklessness, and craft without toughness never survives an English midfield in the first place. That's the third piece of McMahon's definition locking into place. Souness gave him cleverness. Reid gave him relentlessness. Robson gave him completeness, the idea that real toughness isn't one skill bolted onto a player, it's every skill present at once, for the full 90 week after week, injury or no injury. 3 names in, 2 more to go. And the next one is where this whole story stops being what you think it is. Because up to this point, every lesson McMahon has picked up has a physical edge to it somewhere. Souness intimidates. Reid grinds. Robson does both constantly. If you're following along expecting name number 4 to be another midfield enforcer, another set of studs and shoulders, you're about to be wrong. Let that sink in for a second. Gaza, the most naturally gifted English midfielder of his generation. A player defined in the public imagination by flair, by tears, by chaos off the pitch as much as brilliance on it. Not exactly the profile you'd expect on a list built around toughness. And that's precisely why McMahon puts him there. Because here's what people miss about playing against Gascoigne in his prime. It wasn't just that he could beat you with a dragback or split you open with one pass. It was that he could take a battering, absorb hit after hit from midfielders who were absolutely trying to rough him up out of the game, and just keep coming back for the ball. Defenders and midfielders across the country spent entire matches trying to physically discourage Gascoigne, trying to make him not want it. And more often than not, in his best years, he simply refused to stop wanting it. That's the twist in the argument, and it's the real thesis of this whole video landing right here. Toughness, to McMahon, was never purely about who could dish out the hardest tackle. It was about who could survive in a hostile, physical midfield and still produce their best football regardless. Gascoigne could get kicked from box to box for 80 minutes and still have the balance, the composure, and the sheer bloody-mindedness to produce something decisive in the 81st. That's not the absence of toughness. That's a different, arguably rarer version of it. Picture it from the other side of the ball for a second. You're a young, combative midfielder in the late 80s, told before kickoff to go and physically discourage the most gifted player in England. You do your job. You kick him early, hard, exactly like you were told. And 90 seconds later he's already got the ball back, already shifted his weight past you, already produced the pass that starts the move that ends the game. That's a specific kind of demoralizing that no amount of pre-match instruction prepares you for. There's an argument that this version is actually harder to sustain than the physical kind. A player like Jones or a young, hot-headed McMahon could channel aggression outward, use it as fuel, let it show. Gascoigne had to do the opposite. He had to absorb whatever was being aimed at him, physically and often mentally, and somehow keep his touch soft enough, his decision-making sharp enough, to still be the most dangerous player on the pitch. Anger makes you predictable. Opponents could set traps for a player who was going to react. Gascoigne, for large stretches of his best seasons, simply refused to give them that reaction, and kept producing anyway. That's a version of toughness that doesn't get talked about nearly enough in these conversations, because it doesn't fit the traditional mold. It's not about who you can hurt. It's about who can hurt you and still walk away with the Man of the Match award. McMahon watched that happen more than once from close range, and it clearly left a mark on how he thought about the word. Think about what that actually means for the definition we started with. Vinnie Jones's tackle on McMahon at Wembley was a single act of physical dominance, delivered, absorbed, and forgotten within the same half. Gascoigne's toughness was the opposite. It was cumulative. It was 90 minutes of taking punishment and refusing to let it change who you were as a footballer. One is a moment, the other is a mentality. And once you see that distinction, you start to understand why McMahon never built his story around Jones in the first place. The tackle was theater. Gascoigne was substance. Let's be fair to Jones for a second, though, because this isn't about erasing him. Nobody's saying that hit at Wembley didn't hurt, or that Jones wasn't a genuinely combative, physical footballer in his own right across a long career. He was. But McMahon's argument, built quietly over 2 decades of facing genuinely elite opposition, is that the hardest men in football were rarely the ones chasing that reputation on purpose. They were the ones who simply refused to be moved off their game match after match, whether that refusal looked like Souness' cold control, Reid's endless legs, Robson's total game, or Gascoigne's stubborn brilliance under fire. Which brings us to the final name, the one that closes the circle and drags this whole conversation into the modern era. By the time Keane was tearing through Premier League midfields in the 90s and 2000s, McMahon's own playing career was already winding down. But the two eras overlap just enough and the respect runs deep enough that Keane belongs on this list not as a leftover from a different generation, but as proof that the values McMahon picked up from Souness, Reid, Robson, and Gascoigne didn't die out. They got carried forward. Keane was Manchester United's engine for over a decade, a captain who demanded standards from teammates as fiercely as he demanded them from himself. Ferociously competitive, unapologetically confrontational when he felt something needed saying, and, crucially, technically excellent in a way his reputation as a hard man often overshadows. He wasn't just aggression. He was aggression built on top of genuine footballing intelligence, the same combination that made Souness so dangerous a decade earlier. That parallel isn't a coincidence, and it's worth spelling out. Souness controlled matches through composure and calculation. Keane controlled them through sheer will, dragging teammates up to his own standard through force of personality as much as through his own performances. Different delivery, same underlying idea. A midfielder who refuses to let the match happen to him, who insists on dictating its terms no matter what the opposition throws at him. McMahon recognized that trait immediately, because it's the exact trait he'd first encountered in Souness 20 years earlier, just wearing a different shirt and a different decade's haircut. There's also the leadership piece, which tends to get lost under all the flashpoints and the confrontations that made Keane's reputation so combustible in the tabloids. Strip away the headlines, and what's left is a captain who dragged a talented, but occasionally soft Manchester United squad through knockout football on pure refusal to lose. That's not a quality you can fake for a highlight reel. It shows up over 2 legs, over a title run-in, over a season where everyone around you is tired and you simply aren't allowed to be. Vinnie Jones himself, when listing the players he considered the hardest he ever faced, put Roy Keane in that same company as Robson and McMahon. Different generation, same profile. And that's really the point. The players McMahon respected most weren't linked by era or by club. They were linked by a shared refusal to be pushed off their game, in 5 completely different ways, across 3 different decades of English football. Here's the part that actually annoys McMahon a little, if you read between the lines of how he tells this story. It's not that Jones gets remembered. It's what gets remembered instead of everything else. Football media, then and now, runs on the clip that travels. A single reckless tackle at Wembley is easy to package, easy to caption, easy to sell over and over for 35 years on anniversary posts and nostalgia channels. A player quietly outthinking a title rival across 90 minutes, or grinding through a Merseyside derby without a single moment of individual drama, doesn't package the same way. There's no thumbnail for relentless. There's no viral clip for completeness. So the industry defaults to the version that sells, and over enough years, that version quietly becomes the accepted definition. Ask a casual fan what toughness in 80s football looked like, And there's a decent chance the first image that comes to mind is Jones going through McMahon at Wembley. Not because it was the toughest thing that happened that decade, but because it was the easiest thing to keep showing people. That's not a conspiracy. Nobody needs to force that outcome. It's just what happens when reputation gets built by algorithm and archive footage instead of by the players who were actually out there facing each other every week. McMahon spent a career on the receiving end of that dynamic in both directions. He got hit by the tackle everyone remembers, and he delivered one right back at Anfield not long after that barely gets mentioned at all. A challenge on Jones so full-blooded it needed a stretcher. Nobody built a legend around that one either. It didn't fit the story that had already been written. So let's bring this all the way back to Wembley 1988, and that tackle everyone remembers. Steve McMahon getting flattened by Vinnie Jones in the opening minutes of an FA Cup final is a genuinely iconic piece of football history. Nobody's taking that away from it. But if you ask the man who actually lived through it what toughness really meant across his career, he doesn't point to the moment he got hit. He points to 5 men who never let him settle, who forced him to be smarter, harder working, more complete, more resilient, and more competitive across 90 minutes at a time, not 90 seconds. Graeme Souness taught him that control beats chaos. He walked away from that 1983 Anfield defeat, having learned more from being outmaneuvered than most players learn from winning. Peter Reid taught him that reputation means nothing without relentless work, that 90 minutes of unglamorous running can matter more than any single moment a crowd remembers. Brian Robson taught him what a genuinely complete midfielder looks like, a player who did everything, carried everything, and somehow kept doing it through injury after injury. Paul Gascoigne taught him that surviving punishment and still producing brilliance is its own kind of hard, arguably a rarer and more demanding one than simply dishing punishment out. And Keane proved that all of it, the control, the work rate, the completeness, the refusal to break, could still exist in a football era that had already moved on from McMahon's own, carried forward by a captain who refused to let standards slip just because the calendar had changed. Put those 5 together and you get something closer to McMahon's actual definition of toughness than any single tackle ever could. It's not one quality. It's the layering of several: mental control, physical endurance, all-round completeness, resilience under punishment, and relentless leadership, each one contributed by a different man, at a different point in his career, none of them chasing a reputation for being hard in the way Jones openly cultivated his. 5 names. 5 completely different definitions of the same word. And a Wembley highlight reel that, according to the man at the center of it, never really told the story at all. The tackle got the headline. These 5 men got the trophies. So here's the real question, and I want your honest verdict on this one. Out of Souness, Reid, Robson, Gascoigne, and Keane, who do you think genuinely deserves to be called the toughest of that entire era? And does a single dramatic tackle, the kind that gets replayed for decades, actually tell us less about toughness than 90 minutes of quiet consistency ever could? Drop your take in the comments. I read every one of them. A like genuinely helps more than you'd think. And subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into the players who actually defined the eras we love arguing about. Football at this scale is never just a tournament. It's a moment in time,